You're listening to The Sector, a podcast brought to you by Impact Organizations of Nova Scotia, or IONS, where we demystify what is happening in the community impact sector. We'll talk the good, the bad, the ugly, and what it is to work in nonprofits. I'm your host, Lydia Phillip, and today in this conversation, I'm joined by my co-host, Kristen Faulkner. Systems and structures aren't serving the nonprofit sector, leading to recruitment challenges, burnout, and asks for leaders that may be above and beyond their already filled schedules and daily tasks. In this episode, we'll discuss recruitment and retention in the community impact sector, workforce trends, the importance of succession planning, the pressures on leaders and executive directors, and the idea of radical reform and the space beyond that. In this conversation, we're joined by Bradley Day, co-founder and co-CEO of Placemaking 4G, and Joelle Badman of Joelle Badman Consulting. Both are supporting the community impact sector through a human-centered approach and more equitable solutions. Thanks for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
Can you tell me a little bit about why your work is aligned with the sector, and tell me about what you do for work and what your connection is with IONS and nonprofit leaders?
I'll start a bit with kind of P4G's origin almost 8 years ago now, which seems kind of wild. And I think a lot of that came from Matt and I's frustration in our own careers of like, what are we going to do to find meaningful, purposeful work that we feel like we're having an impact in the world? And then we struggled to find that for ourselves. And so it's like, who's responsible for finding people these kinds of opportunities? And we saw a big gap in the recruitment sector and decided to try to do something about that. Decided to try to, make some shifts to how things are done in recruiting. There were people saying that they'd, rather get a root canal than go through an interview process, and it shouldn't feel that way, should it? So we wanted to demystify recruiting a bit too. I think there's a lot of kind of fear and anxiety even approaching the job process, like the whole application process, and really kind of help it be a lot more equitable. And so that's, I don't think it's ever going to be something that we figure out that's fully equitable and, the application process is fully figured out. For years now, I've been like, what's the new resume? And we're still on resumes. So we've provided lots of different ways to apply and all those kinds of things, but I don't know, still using resumes. So, I think over the years, it's gotten a lot better, and we've been able to help organizations find people in a way that feels really good, in a way that people feel seen and heard. And that's really our main focus, is to make people feel seen and heard through the process. And now a lot of my personal focus is, what about when they get there? What are they going into? What kind of environments? And I think as the conversation goes, I'll talk more about kind of nonprofit leadership and burnout and all those kinds of things. Maybe I'll get more into that. But for now, maybe I'll just stop there.
So I am a social worker by trade. I've spent my whole career in the community impact sector and not-for-profits, working for government, in academia as well. And I've always done a little bit of consulting on the side as part of that journey. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to take the leap and do consulting full-time. And that really came from my own personal need to have more autonomy over my time. I was a senior manager in a community impact organization, and I have a small child. I'm a foster caregiver, and I just really felt like I was struggling to juggle all those competing demands, and feeling like I'm coming up short in every way. And so taking the leap to consulting was a way to think about how I could continue to do work that I think is really important and work that really challenges me, working with really cool organizations like IONS and some of their partners, and work that I can contribute to meaningfully, while also simultaneously juggling and balancing the competing demands of my life. And then on top of that, in the spring, worked with IONS specifically on a project related to the labor market here in Nova Scotia and what organizations are seeing. So we did a series of interviews with 23 different executive directors and leaders in community impact organizations across the province, and talked to them about retention and recruitment and succession planning and what they want policymakers to know about all of those things. And so I've got some great results and insights from those folks to share today.
That's awesome. All the good stuff that we'll be talking about. What about you, Kristen? What has your journey been like?
Yeah, so much alignment with parts of each of your stories. When Lydia and I were thinking about which staff members at IONS get to co-host with her through this this series of episodes, felt like some of what I've been through in my journey and my work experience would probably relate to some of the workforce trends we've seen, some of what you've shared. So I started in this sector around 20 years ago, and I worked here in the province and in Vancouver and in New Zealand, where I lived for 6 years with my family. And in the first sort of decade of my career, I was in more frontline positions in volunteer engagement and fundraising at organizations that were providing services to the sector, and really loved it. That's what drew me into the sector from a young age, volunteering and seeing my place of privilege and capacity to kind of use my voice to help other people felt really important to me. And then after a decade in the sector, I got really interested in organizational development because I felt like so many places I was working were trying to serve, community impact, but the people working there were really unwell in terms of like the work-life balance or the demands. Obviously I've seen some really great things as well, but on the whole, I started questioning the way that nonprofits are set up and the way that we draw a lot from other sectors in terms of performance management and recruitment, and we're unique in our own way. So how might we develop different ways of structuring our teams? And I got really interested in growth, organizational growth, and then therefore leadership. But it only took another decade before I was like, I don't really know how I can face the demands of these roles either. And so really relate, Joelle, to your comment of like feeling like I'm falling short in some ways. And most recently, I've been in a couple of managing director roles, so kind of closely aligned with executive directors and watching the loneliness of their role, but also then starting a family on my own and coming to terms with some health conditions and stuff. I just realized the demands of the structure of leadership in lots of nonprofits isn't going to work well with my life. And so feel really happy kind of stepping away from this trajectory that I was imagining for myself of really supporting organizations and acknowledging that you can support organizational growth from lots of different levels. But it felt like the more that I felt the responsibility for it, the more I realized the realities and the isolation and the worries that come along with that too.
And that's something that we hear as well in the sector, is that EDs are burning out and are leaving. And so that begs the question, does anyone want to be an ED anymore? Bradley, what are you seeing as someone who actually did our last ED recruitment role and works really closely with this sector?
Yeah, the nice thing about that role is that part of it could be advertised as eventually, I know that IONS is striving towards more of a collective leadership, more of a leadership, like shared ownership of responsibilities in that kind of way. And so it was a lot easier to talk to candidates to be like, it's not going to be like this forever. If you're going into a role with an organization where you're, at the center of that hourglass, controlling the sand as it moves from board to staff and holding all the relationships and all the responsibilities and financial, it's a lot to carry for not that much money. And, I think there's been a lot of really amazing leaders that have held up organizations for a long time. And at what cost, personally, is kind of what it comes to. And I think people with experience in it are kind of like, I don't know anymore if this is really what I'd like to do. And then I think there are some people that are really eager to step into those shoes and step into those types of opportunities and lead organizations and show maybe that it can be different, it can look different, we can do this, we can lean into trusted leadership. And I think that model is something that is on the rise. How to do it well, think about myself and even the challenges that we've had at P4G of being co-founders and having two people and it being a little less lonely. But I think even at a small organization, things can start to silo and things can start to so it's really tricky to stay connected and to keep and maintain that relationship in leadership. And so, I hope to see more nonprofits go to more of a shared leadership model that sees the accountabilities and responsibilities more spread out, and actually engage boards in a way that there's a lot of skills and there's a lot of energy that the boards have. So how do you actually use those skills to your advantage is sometimes extremely underutilized. So yeah, there's I think a lot of folks that are still very keen. And those that have like been there and done it, it's like it's hard to convince to want to still do that, because at what cost? I was reading. Last thing I'll say on this is like I was reading Gabor Mate's book, The Myth of Normal, and he was talking about all of the environmental and social conditions that affect our health and stress and these things in our childhood, but a lot of the workplace stresses that are showing up for people do impact us, and from a health perspective, and especially women, and especially a lot of women are taking on these types of roles. And so at what cost? It can't be this way for forever, and it really needs to shift into something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think we hear a lot in different types of research that we do at IONS around what's happening at burnout at all levels. And this year, when we got Joelle to come along and interview executive directors, we wanted to explore through, because we do a lot of surveys and interviews, we wanted to explore through some dialogue, all the details of what organizations are excited about, what the challenges are. And so we had some ideas about what was going to come out in that, this being one of them. And as a team of kind of between 8 and 12 staff at IONS, we also experience a lot of these challenges and opportunities and excitements too. But we might turn it over to Joelle and ask you if you can tell us a little more about the themes and kind of what you heard in those interviews.
We heard a lot. And I think, we did 23 interviews, and they were all booked for an hour, and they all went over an hour because people just had so much to share, and they wanted a space to talk about how complex this work is. And they were all senior leaders, so they're people who are kind of shouldering that burden a lot of the time by themselves or with a little bit of support. In terms of the strengths of the sector, obviously, when I asked folks, what do your staff say is going well, everybody talked about community and flexibility, that the sector offers a lot of flexibility that other sectors don't, that people are keen to be there because they align or believe in the mission of the work, and they want to do that work that's purposeful, that's community-driven, that's impacting people's lives directly. There's oftentimes a lot more autonomy in this sector as well, so people can take an idea and maybe bring it to life, and there's a lot of excitement about being able to do that and work within structures that are flexible enough to do that, and that people like to be involved in the decision-making. And so you see that, and I think that goes back to what Bradley was saying about thinking about different ways of leadership showing up in these organizations. We see that formally and informally. So those are some of the reasons why people want to come into the sector, but some of the reasons why people are leaving the sector or not coming into it in the first place. Number one, without not a shock to anybody, was wages and compensation. And especially in the time we live in right now where things are so expensive and so costly, inflation is astronomical. The wages have not kept up, and they've largely not kept up because of the funding that's given to these organizations doesn't include cost of living increases. And so people are generally really struggling to stay in the sector and live their lives and pay their bills and raise their kids and their families. We also heard a lot about sort of the challenges around change management processes. So whether that's succession, so not being able to retain people and seeing turnover in board, turnover in leadership positions, turnover in the front line, all of that has a ripple effect through the entire organization. People end up carrying additional burdens and responsibilities for an indefinite period of time, depending on how the recruitment goes, and then they're shouldering additional weight that leads to burnout, that leads them to leave. And so it's this terrible cycle of folks not being able to sustain the work, either because they can't afford to financially or they can't afford to emotionally and mentally either. So those are some of the main sort of high-level findings. There were lots of more detailed findings as well.
Yeah, I always find it interesting when we're brainstorming around how we're going to bring people into conversation to share these stories and what's affecting them in the sector. And just, this willingness for people to talk and be in conversation, I think also speaks to how people are they just need to talk, and they're feeling isolated and lonely. So to have 23 leaders who have a lot going on in their day-to-days be willing to come and talk about things, I think, kind of speaks to the need for it. And we talked a lot about recruitment and retention and what's happening in the sector, and there's ideas that we have. But I'm also like curious, Joelle, in like your conversations with people, was there a story, or was there something that like really stood out to you?
There are two very specific interviews come to mind. One was with an executive director who said to me, I feel like I contribute to the precarity of my employees' lives. And because the funding that we have doesn't allow me to pay them what they're worth or what they deserve, or even to cover the cost of living. And so this person was sort of expressing the moral dilemma that they feel as a leader, to have all these people who work for them, who they care for, who they want, who they believe are wonderful employees, and they want to offer them everything they can. And then they can't do it because their hands are so tied to the public funding that they get primarily through government. And so I think there's a piece around that like ethical or moral imperative that leaders are also facing, of trying to carry that weight and feel like you can't do anything about it because you're so tied by really strict and restrictive funding models. An example of that, another person that I spoke with had told me, so I did these interviews in May of 2024. So this person told me that between January and May, they had gotten $65,000 in funding grants, of which only $260 could go to cover staff salaries. So there's a lot of money out there for the offering, but not for the skill, the expertise, the people who offer that offering. Sorry, that was a weird way to say that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
But sorry, that there's money out there to do the work, but not necessarily money to pay the people who are doing the work. And so that's just like astonishing and shocking. And I think it's something that we see in the sector, is that it is still heavily undervalued. We don't value the work that goes into it. There's a long history of like why that's the case. It's oftentimes perceived still as women's labor or women's work, or that you should do it because you're passionate about it or you care about people, and you shouldn't be compensated properly for it as a result of that. And so I think that those two stories for me shine a light on what makes this so difficult for leaders and for organizations as a whole, and why we're seeing such a struggle in the sector.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I feel like the expectation from funders is like, prove to us that you can do this work. And with all of these incredible people that you have, show us that you've proven history in doing this in order to apply for this. And then you show them that, and then you show them the people that it takes to actually do that. And then they're like, okay, here's money, but none of it's for the people. You're like, well, how are we supposed to do it? I don't understand. The math's not mathing.
The math doesn't math. Yeah. And people, I think the other thing too is that they are looking in Nova Scotia, the competition for the nonprofit sector is not necessarily the private sector. We have a lot of universities in the province. We have a lot of folks who work for different levels of government in the province. I also heard from folks who said, I've been asked to take a summer student through like a federal or provincial government program, and those summer students were given a cost of living increase from last year to this year. But my applications for funding over the past 5 years have all been denied cost of living increases. So you have summer students, and I'm not saying summer students deserve a cost of, everybody deserves cost of living increase, but it's sort of this like duality that like there's one set of standards if you're in working for government or working in different types of institution, and there's a completely different set of standards for nonprofits. And we're just also supposed to live with it or, be fine with that. And I think people are really feeling that frustration right now.
Yeah, definitely. There was an article in the media earlier this year that our team was sharing with one another about how folks work in the sector because they're passionate about it and they love it, and therefore I don't know if it was should or do kind of accept lower wages. And it was so out of touch with the reality of the sector. And it got a lot of traction. And we're more having conversations around the comment section, which is never a good idea to go there, but we kind of all went there. And
the trap of the comments.
Yeah. the perception of people's perception of the sector. But it was a little bit frightening for sure. All the things that you found in the research were definitely in that comment section about who should do this work and how much it should be compensated and et cetera, et cetera. So that narrative hasn't really moved forward very quickly. But then in other circles that I'm in and in other organizations that I see really leading the way, whether it's through compensation or other means of giving staff work-life balance, we're starting to see things change as well, right? So it was almost jarring for me to be brought back into a conversation that feels like it belongs 50 years ago, or maybe never belonged.
To that point, again, I feel there's always felt to me that there's a lot of invisible labor in nonprofit. Even when you think about it, like nobody wins 100% of the grants that they write. So what percent is that for your organization? Is it 60%? Is it 30%? Is it 80%? That means the other percent is all like labor that you wouldn't bake 50 cookies to sell 20 of them. Like there was a lot of energy that went in materials and efforts that went into that. And like we're just going to sell 20 cookies and be like, okay, the rest is going to be wasted. But everybody would be like, what are you doing? You're wasting that. And that's a conversation I feel like doesn't happen often. Which was a lot of the reasons that we wanted to be a social enterprise as opposed to a nonprofit. It felt like, I got ADHD. To just show up and do what I need to do every day seems like a lot of work. To show up and do work that I'm like, not a guarantee that anything's going to happen with this. It's like, yeah, I can't do it. I don't know. I just can't get myself there. But yeah, that's always been something that I've thought about when it came to nonprofits, is so much invisible labor that doesn't really get recognized. But to your point about organizations that are trying to shift things into more positive, it feels like it's definitely happening. And there's definitely organizations like IONS that is doing a lot to step into like showcase this is what is possible in the nonprofit sector, in the impact sector. And at the same time, it also is beholden to a larger system. So anytime you start to like make these kind of changes that are like, oh, we're going to disrupt things and we're going to get away from how things are typically done, you still are under the confines of capitalism and the way that the world currently operates. So how then do you balance like existing within this system and trying to kind of tear it down and dismantle it at the same time? It's like hospicing. It's like, let's lay this to bed and thank it for everything that it's brought us in this world.
Yeah.
But it's time for you to go to bed now.
Yeah. Have a nice ceremony about it.
Can I just add to one of the things that I heard from folks around Bradley's point about the effort that goes into funding applications and grant writing was really around the fact that a lot of the community impact organizations in the province are offering critical services that the province itself doesn't want to deliver or can't deliver. And they're having to submit funding applications for those critical services on an annual basis or a 3-year basis sometimes, when everybody knows that they are the main service delivery partner of the government for that thing, and the government knows it. And so there's really no reason why those things, and the contracts oftentimes have like an out clause where, you can end the contract with whatever kind of parameters are around it. And so there's really no reason to have to go through that arduous process every year and take away that human labor that could go towards the actual work and the impact of the work to do something that we all know, this organization is always going to be one of the main offerers of this particular service. And so there's a lot of hope that maybe that could be heard, or that we can think differently about some of these structures that we have in place that are oftentimes very overly bureaucratic, a lot of red tape, and we can just imagine that they would be done differently, and it would everybody who's involved would be really thankful, including all the government partners, right? Like, I'm sure they're not loving the massive bureaucracy either. It's a win-win.
Yeah, so many things. The beauty of starting this podcast series off with the trends and what we're hearing is that we're like laying it all on the table, all of the things that you're seeing in recruitment and retention.
It's
that
like a fire
hearing.
hose. Once it opens, the water is like.
My mind's like, I want to go here, I want to go here. One of the things, so my role at IONS is I'm on the sector transformation team, and when I'm trying to describe that to people not in the sector, or even to myself, I am thinking about how we sort of split our time at IONS across some of those long-term systems change and advocating for the types of things we're talking about, like disrupting and hospicing some of the structural constraints. And at the same time, like what can we innovate or try out now while we're on that maybe longer journey of shifting the system and shifting the infrastructure. And so I'm curious from both of you, we're curious around like, what are you seeing? And I know, Bradley, when you started talking about recruitment and retention, you were touching on some of it, but what are some of the things you're seeing in terms of responding to these challenges that we're talking about, either in recruitment or keeping employees, which is a big question?
Well, it's hard. Personally, it's hard for me to answer this from the perspective of just within the sector, because it's kind of like a global world systems issue. So it's like hard to isolate it to one sector to be like, this is what's happening in the sector and what needs to, it's more, to me, I pull myself up and I'm like, what's happening in the world that needs to shift and what happening? And so, yeah, I think there are certain trends but I'm maybe going to start more high level, because back to this hospicing, I didn't invent that. There's a book called Hospicing Modernity that like really gave me a lot of the language for what's happening in the world right now. And very powerful book. And in it, one part that was like, oh, wow, okay, this is really important. And what is like the words that I've been looking for this thing is around reform. And when we talk about the current systems and the world we live in, we need to talk about how we're going to reform it. And it labeled it into 3 different types of reform. There's soft reform, there's like radical reform, and then there's beyond reform. And that one's the most interesting to me. Soft reform would be something like, okay, we hired the ED who's like a person of color and they're going to lead the organization, but nothing else changes. The policies are the same. Everything's just business as usual, but look, we did the thing. Look, reform, we're changed now. Radical reform would be like also changing all of our policies, adding a 4-day work week, like fighting for, like continuing to dismantle all of the systems, but it still exists within capitalism. It still exists within this current economic system. Beyond reform is like, what if we took away the filter that we see the world with, that is the capitalist lens? If we removed that filter, what then is possible? And the quote from the book that always kind of stuck with me around that was like, maybe we'd be able to see what's attainable but unimaginable. Because it's attainable, we can do it, it's right there. But it's unimaginable because we're looking at things through the context of capitalism. So all 3 of those things are important to happen at the same time. You can't jump into the banking system and be like, we're going to radical reform or like beyond reform. They're going to be like, whoa, slow down. So like all of these are important to happen at the same time. And whatever, I think in the nonprofit sector, it's more like people are wanting to see radical reform and beyond reform. The soft reform stuff, like, miss me with that. That's for people that are just at the starting line of reform. And so I think that there's a lot that can happen in that radical and beyond reform that the nonprofit sector can be leaders in.
Yeah, I think there's more like in the sector that you can do around like flexibility and like doing things differently. And I think that's one place that we see like the sector being able to lead this type of work. And that's where we've leaned in a lot at IONS, to like inspire and give people some of those tools to try new things and show people like what's possible. But that is also a big ask. It's hard to like imagine, reimagine, change structures when you have all of these other burdens because we exist in capitalism and bureaucracy. And so, yeah, it's like, how do we support people in doing that? And that also kind of feels like a big question, but it's also sometimes why people stick around and why they see like their place in the sector. And like, what are you hearing? What are people, why do people stay? Because as we know, goodwill isn't going to pay the bills. We're keeping people motivated. And how do we get to beyond reform?
I heard a lot about from the folks that I interviewed about really taking like a humanistic or a human-centered approach to the way that they model or live out quote unquote policies within the organization. And so oftentimes I heard so frequently, this is what we have in writing, but this is what we do in practice. And what we do in practice is so much more human-centered and catering to the needs of our employees. And the reasons we can't change the policy, there's a lot of them, right? Like it's time and it's energy and it's board approval and it's all different kinds of things. But the way that it plays out in reality is that we're trying to support our people the best that we can to show up, fulsomely and wholly at work, and then also the same thing when they're at home. And I think that really speaks to like the spirit of the sector is that like we are all human beings who happen to work with each other, and seeing and recognizing that in one another and trying to live that out, even if it can't be operationalized officially. And so I heard so many different examples of ways that people try to bring that flexibility and that recognition into the work without it necessarily always having to be like an official policy or operational manual bylaw related thing.
Yeah, I feel like practices can go so far. I'm really bad at retaining data, statistics, and passing them on. I'm listening to you, Bradley, pass along quotes from a book, and I'm in awe. But I was at a conference.
I'm just a broken record at this point.
I was at a conference last week, and folks were talking about across all sectors retention. And there's this kind of older saying, I think, of the generations who are retiring out now that like you don't quit a job, you quit your boss. But someone was giving some data around how that's not true anymore, that if someone has a boss they want to quit but has really good team members, that they actually stay. So I wish I could give you some numbers around that, but I can't. But it made me think about the things that keep me in the sector and the smallest practices that can actually go really far. So like listening to these different types of reform, and a 4-day work week was an example of maybe one of the more radical ones. And that's definitely, we have that at IONS, and absolutely was life-changing for me, especially with a young kid at home. And we have a lot of flexibility about hybrid working, but also like it's not on a schedule. And I see a lot of my friends who have hybrid work, which is still great, and it's on a schedule. And we have these little cultural like practices within our organization around how we connect with one another about how we might need to shift the days in the office versus not, which is again so important to me. And one of the things that is probably a software reform, I think. I feel like I'm looking at you like you're my teacher now. But we started working seasonally about 1.5 years ago. And right now we're in our reflection season. And one of the constraints, I think, of probably every sector is that October and November are conference season and networking and like event season. Everyone wants to have their events at the same time. And so for the month of December, or for 3 weeks in December, we intentionally cancel a bunch of internal meetings and we host debriefs and we just slow down. And when we first proposed it, we too were like, how is this going to be possible? It can't be. It's going to be too hard. And yeah, I just, without going into all the details, I think it for me has been one of the most the biggest shifts in my work-life balance. And now I'm like, I can't work anywhere that doesn't have a reflection season. How will I do it?
Yeah. Well, I think personally that is pretty radical. Like when, even in recent history, have you heard of organizations focusing and intentionally designing how it should feel to work here? Like that is pretty radical to me. And I think that is a standout thing that the impact sector does have and can attract people with, is that uniqueness of, designing workplaces that do feel human-centric. And, I think life happens in the space between the notes, and there's like all the wins and successes and things that we're doing, and look, we did this, and look, we did that. But what about the everyday conversations? What about like the permission to just be? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in the heady stuff of like, did I word that the right way? Did I say that the right way? Did I offend somebody? Do we need to read a new book now because we've like, hurt somebody's feelings? And we get all caught up in like, how can we have a repair process and healing and all this stuff? But we don't just focus on joy and having fun. And I think getting back to a lot of that after so much heaviness can be a really big opportunity for the impact sector, is to focus again on joy, focus again on levity, focus again on connection, and not losing sight of like kind of the lowercase or uppercase P politics of the work that we're doing, and, the advocacy and everything that we want to see happen in all of this reform. But if we lose humor and connection and joy and the levity, then it's just going to feel hard all the time. And sometimes it's going to be hard. It's going to be a lot of work. People just got elected locally and, in our neighbors somewhere. So it's like, that reminded me of like, oh yeah, this is going to be hard work. It's going to be a lot. It's going to take big energy to get through, to push the needle. And I'm ready for that. But also I'm ready to just have some fun and laugh and like hang out with people that are good human beings. And that's, I think, where you find a reason to want to be in the impact sector.
Yeah, if we lose the joy, I think we lose a lot of why we do what we do. So I'm always such a big fan of bringing it back to joy and humor and, like just existing together. And so what is one myth about leadership, and this could be your own personal leadership, that you feel like you're busting and breaking in your own way?
Just the first thing that pops into my head is I'm not a very good manager. And there's a very big difference between managing and leading. And I'm good at the strategy and high level, like vision and those kinds of things and how the place feels and all that. But I'm not great at managing people. And to ask for help around that has been a challenge as a leader, to be like, nah, it's my responsibility. I'm supposed to, manage all the things. And it's just not something I'm good at. So there's that distinction is what I'd say.
I think for me, over the past sort of like 5 to 7 years of my own experience being in like, senior leadership positions and then going into this like self-employment role is how truly powerful like showing up authentically as yourself, like flawed and vulnerable and willing to share of yourself with people, transforms relationships so significantly in like every possible way. And you don't have to be an executive director to do that. You can be at any level. But if you are willing to show up for people, but also as yourself wholly and with passion and with flaws and all the things, the whole messy bit, I feel like you start leading and changing the way that people identify or think about leadership and what it takes to be any kind of change maker. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Love it.
That's awesome. So we heard don't have to be perfect, ask for help, vulnerability, and authenticity.
And beyond reform.
And you can also beyond radical.
Beyond, there we go.
All of it. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation.
This was fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Go Ions.
Woo.
Woo.
Connect with us on Instagram at Ions Canada or on LinkedIn at Impact Organizations of Nova Scotia, and visit the Ions website at ions.ca.